pain of abuse doesn't simply go away over time. It lingers, it shapes how we live, how we relate, and even how we care for ourselves and others. And in the busyness of everyday life, it can be really hard to face that pain. Maybe you've talked with a trusted friend or have done some personal work, but still, it can feel like you're not going deep enough to really address the weight of your story. That's where Recovery Week comes in. For over 30 years, Dr. Dan Allender and the Allender Center have hosted these immersive workshops for men, for women, and now for women with a focus on racial trauma and healing. Recovery Weeks gives you the time to step away from your daily life and into a space with small groups, one-on-one sessions, and guided teaching. This is a space where you can truly name the harm of your past, receive good care, and learn to love your own story. And as you engage your past with more honesty and compassion, you'll begin to see the possibility of hope, restoration, and a future. Shaped not by the abuse you suffered, but by the healing, goodness, and life you are moving toward. You can learn more about upcoming dates and the application process for Recovery Weeks at the allendercenter.org/workshops.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center Podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Good people with good bodies. At the Allender Center, if you're listening, we are fiercely committed to continuing to engage the harm of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, as well as the process of healing. And I can't think of a better companion for this continued conversation today than my guest, Dr. Hillary McBride. I am so thrilled that you're joining me, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. I just felt the warmth in your voice and I could feel it in my chest. It feels so good to be here.
Well, I'm delighted, and I know we're going to jump into some complex waters, but if you're not familiar with Dr. McBride's work, she is a registered psychologist, award-winning researcher, speaker, writer, and I would add podcast host. Her books include The Wisdom of Your Body, Practices for Embodied Living, and her most recent labor of love that came out earlier this year, Holy Hurt, Understanding Spiritual Trauma and the Process of Healing. Now, prior to this moment today, we've not actually had the privilege of having a conversation, but I just want to name that through your public presence in writing, you possess such an embodied wisdom and fierce kindness that allows your clinical insights and human-sized stories of healing and flourishing to feel tangible, if not, dare I say, possible. Your passion for making psychology and academic research accessible to a wide variety of people definitely shines through. I think especially in this most recent writing, Holy Hurt, as you weave together your insights, research, and stories with body practices and these very rich conversations with fellow practitioners and healers. And I just want to say one final thing before I will turn it to you, I promise. I just really appreciated the tender and thoughtful ways you made space in your writing for survivors of spiritual trauma to be where we are without demand or prescription, offering such generous imagination for the multitude of ways we might be able to locate ourselves as we read your words. And just that imagination for the multitude of ways we could locate ourselves in our own healing processes. So I just felt your intentionality and your generosity in the kind of wide path that you set for the people engaging your work. So deeply grateful.
Oh, thank you, Rachael. That feels so, oh my gosh, that's just really landing me. That's exactly what I would want for people who are reading this book to feel like they get to be exactly where they are. And what a message contrary to what so many of us who've been in religious contexts that have been abusive and harmful have heard, the story that we have to be somewhere else or we have to be different in order to be good or lovable or safe. And what a relief to feel like we can be where we are and be met.
Yeah, absolutely. And just grateful for, I know in my own healing journey, to have companions in the process, because that can feel so disorienting too. Okay, I like the invitation to be where I am, but I'm so used to someone just telling me, this is the way, and you just do this and everything will be okay, even if so many fractures led to deep questions. So I did want to hear more from you. How did you find yourself engaging so directly, like the reality of spiritual trauma more deeply? Like, what led to this labor of love in this season?
When I was early in my graduate education, I remember taking a trauma course with a giant in the field of traumatology, trauma therapy and intervention, and feeling myself so drawn to that work because it took me a little while to get there. It landed right in a personal way. Often these are the things that, that we feel drawn to, something that resonates with our own material and lived experience. And so as I got into the field of trauma studies and trauma therapy and deepened my research and clinical skill, what I noticed is that as patients were coming to me in my practice who would have never reported a trauma history, who would have never identified as having an index event or meeting, diagnostic criteria for PTSD because, air quotes, like everything was fine and I was loved really well. What I was seeing is that their bodies, the way that they narrated their story, what it felt like to be them inside, it was all saying trauma. It was all saying, there's a trauma history here, but there was a gap in the way it was being organized or conceptualized by them and by me as being not trauma because everyone around them was doing it, because there was a whole theological framework behind why what happened,
Right.
and because it was good and right to believe that they were bad. It was good and right to feel guilt and shame and terror for being in the world. So that the paradox of what I saw in front of me really highlighted something that's foundational about this particular configuration of trauma, which is that it is indeed trauma, and it often lies invisibly in the nervous system and in community systems because of how much social reinforcement and theology and social narrative around it being good lives there, right? There's so much around the way things are in spiritually abusive and traumatic contexts that supports them to be that way. Rhetoric, ideology, behavior, practices, etc. So that for me really opened up this possibility that this could be trauma, legitimate trauma, because at that time, right, we didn't have language to talk about it. I mean, this is like 2015, 2014, 2015, 2016. And like you said to me earlier, I can't remember if this was previously to when the recording started or in the conversation, right? Like there's not so much language for this early on. And so we're groping around in the dark for how do we conceptualize what's happening? And it was really in paying attention to the lives of my patients that I started to look at my own experience too and realized, there's a lot here in my own life that I think made it hard for me to see that what was happening to people was trauma because I couldn't even call it trauma for myself.
Oh, I feel like that's such a unfortunate journey for so many of us that, this thing that, like we're working with other people, we're seeing it, we're naming it, and then all of a sudden having to go, oh, wait a minute, what does this mean for me? Like I know for myself, I had been, I was talking to you beforehand, like all of my, in my Master of Divinity program, all of my research, because I was at the Seattle school and they were like, take your therapeutic insights you're getting from being at this kind of counseling school and all your deepest theological questions and your vocational hopes and write a 25-page paper. It was a great time. It was a great time to be alive for me and in my own brain, which I was like, okay, I will do this. I almost didn't finish it. And that was like its own trauma in and of itself. But like wrestling with, I want to wrestle with my own kind of developmental trauma history and how that formed my spiritual imagination and how these theologies I'm taking in are also disordering things and how do we heal together? And then that was in 2010. And then like 2017, 2018, Dan Allender said, hey, you want to do a podcast with me on spiritual abuse? And I was like, sure. That's kind of a weird, we work in abuse. I understand it. I'm really drawn to people who've been harmed by the church or bad theology. But I'll have this conversation with you. And it was like literally in the middle of this conversation, I start telling this story that I had always been able to identify as like clergy abuse, or, like I dated my youth minister when I was a teenager. I just saw all these people out here that I was helping. And there was something of like having to put language to spiritual abuse with him. And like I started telling the story, just kind of like, like I've had some experiences of church harm in a really fundamental environment. And it was just one of those like lightning bolt moments of like, okay. Okay. This is a new hermeneutical frame for understanding my story. And okay, spiritual abuse, this is real. And I don't just care about it because I care about other people. Like I care about it because it's my story. And I just think that's true for so many of us, especially with something like spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma. And I think you've put this so well. Like it is coming more common. It's becoming more common in like a shared language or cultural imagination. And it can still feel so hard to define. And I think you've done a really good job in your writing, trying to put like a robust imagination for like, what are we talking about when we're talking about spiritual trauma? I mean, even your language and how the house is haunted, what our bodies have always known, which is what I hear you putting words to in your work with clients. But you also do a great job of locating spiritual trauma within like a historical context of like, in some ways, this is not a new phenomenon. It's been in the water. So I would just love to hear more from you, how you help people make sense of like, what are we talking about? And how long has this really been going on?
Yeah. Oof. There's a lot there. Maybe I'll start with the how long, because you're right that this is new for us to make sense of. This is new for us. And when I say us, really who I'm talking about is people, light-skinned European ancestry.
That's right.
Right? Whiteness in North America, or what we would call Turtle Island if we're using the indigenous name for North America. So when we think about the history of spiritual trauma and how long this has been happening, one, we could say that spiritual trauma has been happening as long as people have been using God and naming God in their attempts to grab power and silence and disenfranchise others.
Yeah.
I think spiritual trauma has been happening as long as people have had to make meaning about the awful things in the world and have had to do that in a way that has been disembodied and disconnected from culture and land. And then more specifically, because that can feel like it stretches into our kind of our history in a nebulous way, more specifically and directly to think about first contact and what it was like for our European ancestors to come to North America and take people's land, take their culture, take their customs, to colonize them, to colonize land, and to do so in the name of their deity. I mean, that spiritual trauma and spiritual abuse has been happening for a long time. And the point that I try to make in the book is it makes a lot of sense when we look at the legacy and the stretching reach of spiritual trauma in our present day religious configurations, experiences, because look at the soil it's built on, right? So many of our religious foundations and institutions, and I speak particularly as coming from the Christian tradition, that our tradition on the soil of Indigenous people has the legacy of spiritual trauma rooted in it. So, right, when there's something toxic in the soil, of course it's going to impact the trees. Of course it's going to shape what happens to the fruit.
Yeah.
And then more specifically, I think what does it actually look like in our lives today, and how might we language or craft some sort of sketch of spiritual trauma? Two ideas come to mind, and I'm happy to go into them further if it feels like they're kind of rudimentary. But the first is any trauma that happens in or is justified by religious or spiritual context and figures. So that your trauma happens in the walls of a church or in a synagogue or in, the walls of your spiritual community, or there's a religious or spiritual leader who's there enacting abuse and in a way like instructing the community to engage in these abusive toxic, traumatic practices. But also, and this is perhaps the lesser known flavor or profile of spiritual trauma, trauma that has an impact on our religious and spiritual beliefs and practices, as in trauma that happens outside of the walls of or the relationships with our spiritual and religious community. But because we're offered meaning-making structures from our religious and spiritual communities, we impose the meaning-making on the trauma or interpret trauma through the lens of what we've been handed. For example, just to make it really clear, if someone has been told, God wants all things to happen to you that happen to you, and therefore you're good. And that's a story that someone is handed in development by their family, by their church community, and then they experience sexual abuse by a soccer coach or a teacher, or any kind of, abuse happens in another sphere. And the only way to interpret that is that God wanted this for me. Then there is spiritual trauma woven into that experience of abuse. And my point in the book, if you read it, then you've heard me say this, and for survivors, this might not be so surprising, or maybe will be. My understanding is that all trauma is spiritual trauma. And the reason for that is there is no way for trauma, when it is in fact within that category of what overwhelms us to the point of us facing a kind of death internally on a nervous system level, that there is no trauma that does not impact the way that we experience ourselves in the world. And there is no trauma that does not irreparably shake the foundation of how we interpret what it means to be human, and if we're good, if we're safe, if we can be trustworthy, if others are trustworthy. So there is a story that many of us inherited, that our spirituality is fragmented off from and distinct from our bodily experience, our social experience, our existential experience, our cognition. And what I'm suggesting is that spiritual trauma is all trauma in a way that reminds us that we are deeply integrated, that there is no physical trauma that does not also impact our meaning-making systems, our social sense of identity, location, etc. So that hopefully starts to kind of sketch some parameters, but in doing so, I recognize we include pretty much everything in the container of spiritual trauma.
Yeah, I mean, but it feels very true, and we've named that as well, that in many ways, any form of degradation, of manipulation, of control, of violation, as you put so well, really is an assault on like what it means for all humans to be like image bearers. Like, let's say you still ascribe to a Christian worldview or, deep theological roots. Like, any abuse is assaulting what it means to be human. And that image bearerness is not just like in isolation. It's the sense of shalom of like all of creation and relationships and wholeness. And so you're absolutely right. And I think it can get really tricky because we're talking about something that is true, right? Like, all trauma, all abuse is a spiritual, it is intrinsically in part a spiritual wound. And you've also very well named some clear parameters around like, what do we mean when we talk about religious trauma? And I just think, you kind of put some words. This is actually my next question. I'm just going to say you're doing a really great job of just like moving right into like the questions I have, which is so fun.
Great.
Yeah, just the kind of the double wound of like religious trauma when, the very context that you're being formed in is setting you up for meaning making that actually is like heaping heavy burdens on like an already burdened person. And I can say for myself, I actually had a pretty secure attachment with God. Even though I was raised in a context that like in the larger context was certainly like more fundamentalist, definitely like leaning into some white supremacist. I mean, I'm a Southern Baptist. I was raised Southern Baptist. So there's some white supremacist structures in the beginning of the Southern Baptist Church. I mean, it's separated from other Baptist denominations because it was pro-slavery. Like, that's its beginning. So I'm not like ascribing some judgment. It's just like historically that's in the water, right? But I had just had really good spiritual leaders in my like early childhood development. Like, there was a lot of developmental trauma in my home. There were ways my nervous system was being wired to be like very bent towards fear and anxiety and panic and survival. But I had spiritual, like, I'd say something like, oh, I asked Jesus into my heart, but I'm not being changed, because that was the way it was so being talked about. Like, even as a 4-year-old, you should have some moral, shift in your little world, and I'm like, I still get mad. I still am human. And I had a little VBS teacher that was like, I don't think it's as much about like God coming into your heart as it is like you being wrapped up in the heart of God, like as a beloved identity. Like, I don't know how this person brought that, but there were just these moments where there was just a lot of honoring of my personhood, space for my questions. But when I was a teenager, we moved into a very fundamentalist, probably more meeting some of the criteria of like a cult in some of the insular nature of this particular community. Like, little example, like instead of going to prom, we were encouraged to come to MORP, which is prom spelled backwards, which was like the church's prom.
Right.
It was like very like anti-secular. And it was within this context that I was set up in a relationship with one of my youth leaders. Very rigid gender roles, a lot of fear-based manipulation and control. And it's just like the power of that short amount of time to just completely reorder my sense of who God was. And I think you bring in some of Dr. Allison Cook's language around like spiritual trauma adds this sort of terrifying layer that God might question our worth too. And I think about that particular period of my life because it's where some of the most profound spiritual abuse happened that was heaping heavy burdens on like an already burdened nervous system. So things like 6 months into this dating relationship, which I could say was 100% an abusive setup, I started having massive anxiety because the infatuation had worn off. Like, I didn't actually want to be with this person, but I'm in an environment that's making meaning by saying, well, God wants this. This is a covenant relationship. You're not married, but this is like, you're supposed to be in this. So if you're having different feelings, that's a failure of love. Your anxiety is a lack of faith. Like, everything was being like turned into a spiritual meaning in a way that actually just made God like really like scarier than the developmental trauma I was experiencing. Like, just like I was so bad and I was trying so hard to be good. And you had dedicated your book to all the younger selves who needed to know then, but can finally learn now. You can listen to your body, you can trust yourself, and you're good at your core. And I guess I would love to hear more from you. You bring in Michelle Panchuk's stuff. You do great work around the role of developmental trauma and underdeveloped maturity. So be free to kind of go where you want to go with that. I know that was like a long meandering way to get to a question, but I think I just feel the like very personal impact in my own world. And I've said so many times, if the context I would in had even had like an inch of trauma informed like care, like an inch would have gone like a mile in my little body, like and the meaning making that was actually, it was like a double wound. It was like intensifying the trauma. It was deepening the trauma instead of alleviating it or giving me an imagination like out or forward or yeah.
Thank you for sharing more pieces of your story. My heart aches knowing that that's a part of your reality. And for so many of us, right? I think a couple of things that I'm hearing or feeling connected to as I'm listening to you is the way that the spiritual overlay on top of trauma often reinforces it or keeps us stuck within it or fragments us from possibilities which could be liberating or healing. And I think that going back to the story that I was saying earlier about noticing in my patients that it's kind of screaming trauma. If I look at the nervous system, if I look at the incoherent narrative presentation, if I look at the shame, the defensive structures, like from the psychological case conceptualization perspective, it's screaming trauma. But the person in front of me saying, but no, this is good. This is how it's supposed to be. This was right. Like, I just, there's nothing to look at here. This is exactly how it is for everyone around me too. I don't know anything different. This is how it is. the tricky piece and the heartbreaking piece is when there's trauma, but the interpretation on top of the social and community experiences, this is how it is supposed to be. This is God's will. This is God's way. It really makes it impossible to see it any other way, right? Or maybe a better way of saying that is to challenge that would mean social ostracization and loss, perhaps eternal conscious torment, perhaps, right, punishment.
Or like this loss of like what, even if it's an insecure attachment, like this loss of like a connection to God, right? Like if I question this, then I have to lose it all.
Yeah, which holds the whole thing together. It's the thing that allows the whole abusive system to stay intact, because to challenge it would be even more dangerous. Or in the book, I talk about that as being a consequence, right? That there is punishment or consequences to doing it or seeing it differently, which keeps us right within the system that's harming us without knowing that it could be any different. And in some of the academic literature, a language or a language tool that's used is hermeneutic injustice, which is a way of understanding how systems which are abusive and disempowering to people keep people disconnected from knowledge sources and ways of understanding themselves and the world, which could threaten the abusive system itself. So if you are forbidden from reading any psychology and going to a therapist and having any other way of understanding your nervous system, or even knowing that your body could have a nervous system which has survival impulses and tendencies which are good and right, then it's easier to keep you at war with yourself and at war with any place inside of you which challenges or could threaten whoever's in leadership or power that is asking you to stay powerless to them. So I'm, those two things really come to mind. And then another thought that you brought up that I think is really important here is the way that, my colleague, Dr. Preston Hill, and I are working on some research related to this as part of the Spiritual First Responders Project. And some of the language that I've been using in the last couple of years of conceptualizing this, which we've adopted in some of our papers that we're working on, is the valorization of the infantile psychological self. That in these contexts where healthy, normal developmental experiences are forbidden and punished, and then I would say not just subdued, but completely rejected in the self, that people grow up learning to outsource kind of moral authority to somebody else. So development is suspended. Like my ability to have a voice, my ability to trust my body, my ability to say no, my ability to disagree, to challenge even. I use specific examples like this in the book, to lie. Like it's actually really important developmentally to learn lying and what does it do and understand its impact on relationship. And if we're deprived of experiences like sexual exploration or lying or breaking the rules, then we actually lose out on something developmentally, not just psychically, but also relationally. But where it gets a little more complicated is people in abusive spiritual systems are often praised for not having acquired, integrated some of these developmental tasks. So the more you trust other people, the more you hate your body, the more you have no contact with any kind of inner will or desire or erotic sense of self, the more praised you are for being spiritually mature, which creates a kind of an incentivization and reward around the loss of self. So not only is the loss of self or sense of self is suppressed, because that's really what psychological development is. Psychological development is becoming, growing into more of who you are and acquiring the tasks to face life and to have like a sense of flourishing connected to your identity and social belonging and your ability to be in the world as an adult. That in not only is that suppressed, but then it's rewarded.
That's right.
Right? It's rewarded for not having developed into a secure sense of self and praised for people for being spiritually mature, which can make it really, really difficult for people when coming out of these systems and realizing the kind of the betrayal blindness that they had. I had no clue that I was hoodwinked the whole time, and that what I was told was good and right actually was fragmenting me from myself and from the
Yep,
world, and maybe
that's
from,
right.
the goodness of, if I can use this language, like what is God, the divine, what is sacred in
Mhm.
me, around
That's
me, through all of us, that it becomes really difficult to realize I missed out on lots of really important things, like the right to know who I am in the world and
right.
have space to be in contact with that. So there can be, we would call it religious de-identification, deconstruction, maybe even just like the reckoning with the legacy of trauma. I, as a person, had to go away. And what does it mean to live now? What does it mean to perhaps acquire some of those developmental skills that I missed? What does it mean to grieve the loss of my life up until this point that I gave in service of doing everything right and being good,
Mhm.
but feels like it just harmed
Yeah,
me? There's a lot there for people.
so much. And I just, for those listening, like, I know it's so painful and it's so disorienting, and it can feel almost like, how do I put the pieces back together? How do I build something that, like, didn't get built in the ways it was meant to get built? And
Mhm.
I really appreciate the ways that you help us think about healing as not a linear, triumphant process where we kind of exercise these broken parts of us and arrive at some like destination of goodness, which I think is so fascinating because so much of the toxicity of these environments, because it's so much about control and being good, like the emphasis is not even on like wholeness or like, yeah, becoming a full human, which I actually think is part of like the biblical witness of like what Jesus is inviting us to, like this capacity to like live into complexity and to love like beyond what we imagine is possible, to receive love in ways that is like deeply healing, but like the emphasis on like, "And I've got to become good," which I think for many people coming out of these environments, I'll just speak for myself, we're so enticed by like a new kind of fundamentalism, right? Like, okay, my desire for belonging, like my capacity to trust, like these things that are actually like really good and beautiful about us, like that are like part of what make us human, become dangerous because they bear so much shame, because they bear so much powerlessness, and they become dangerous. They become, something we want to mock. We want to like kind of keep ourselves at bay from. I've just noticed this, like, just for so many people, like this swing toward a new kind of fundamentalism, but maybe it's political. Maybe it's, whatever it is, but there's a kind of splitting. And I think you do a really great job of helping us remember that a part of the healing work that we're called to is actually like radical welcome. It's a
Hmm.
befriending, you're talking about the right people. Certainly Shelley Rambo comes into the conversation around witnessing, which we can talk more about. But you have this line, if trauma is about fragmentation, then healing is about connection. Um, and I think there's just something really powerful about that. I say this to people all the time in like trauma care work. Like, you think what is going to make you whole is like splitting off and exiling or like eradicating these vulnerable parts of you. But actually the work is to like bring them closer, to like welcome them in. And that takes time. And that's like really messy. It's not like, okay, well, I just go to therapy for 6 sessions and then like I do it, right? Like it's good. We're good. Everything's fine. So yes, I would love to hear more from you and your work with people and your own healing journey. What have you noticed
Hmm.
about this kind of nonlinear but very powerful journey of healing?
Yeah.
This radical welcome, this kind of
Yeah.
this witnessing that is
Hmm.
necessary.
Well, it redefines healing as a process, not an event, and a process which unfolds as we live. And that can be really excruciating when we have come from a system which prioritizes like the erasure of anything painful as proof of healing. And that the word, I just want to say something really briefly about that word. It is it's so fraught with complexity in the landscape of spiritual trauma, because so often the word healing has been weaponized
That's right.
It has been used as a tool for harm and coercion around behavioral, spiritual, emotional, cognitive compliance. And so people have been told your healing isn't happening unless you look like us, unless what's painful goes away completely. And so I feel really, lots of complexity around like the kind of the grossness of that legacy of the way the word healing itself has been used to harm. So I like the definition proposed by Judith Herman, where she talks about recovering and recovery. And Katie Cross and Karen O'Donnell, who talk about the post-traumatic remaking of the self. The remaking implies something irreparably has been shattered. And what do we do with the pieces? And I still hold in my heart the possibility of there being actually something more beautiful on the other side. And so when I think about healing, when I think about healing, I think about being in relationship with the pain. And I think about creating a way of being with ourselves and in the world, which brings along the legacy of what's happened to us, which allows us to turn towards what's painful and to let it tell the truth about what happened. I'm imagining, sitting in the room with a version of me who carries the legacy of the trauma and the injuries, and letting her tell her life story and what happened and how painful it was for the rest of our lives. And to be in relationship with her in a way that honors how much pain there was, and to think of healing as not her absence, right? If I'm, again, sitting in the room or sitting at a table with a version of me who holds the memory of trauma, healing doesn't mean she goes away. Healing means that I am with her, continuing to remind her that she's believed it really did happen and she's safe with me now. So the healing is like this letting love in, letting corrective in, letting belief and attunement and witnessing into the places where it was missing. I love Stephen Levine says, healing is to touch with love that which was touched by fear. That he is saying to go right towards the places where we were terrified, where we had to go away, where something inside of us really did die, and to bring love there. And not in the kind of evangelical witnessing way, but in the kind of love that says, I can make space for all of the pain kind of way. And I'll stay here the whole time, all the way through to the other side. So when I see that in myself, there's a hopefulness. Like when I think about the application of this to my own life and my own spiritual trauma, the hopefulness and going, oh, it can still hurt. I can be on the healing journey and it can still hurt. Of course, actually, the model that I'm trying to present around healing accounts for there still being pain. It's not the erasure of pain. It's not the disappearance of the wounds. It's like, oh, whoa, there's actually a way to be with that. And there's something I won't get into the details of here, but there's something in my life that's actively unfolding right now that feels exquisitely painful. And when I think about my instinct to control and manage it and try to create an outcome that I want to try to create, it actually leaves me feeling more stuck and disempowered because there's some level of awareness I have that I can't actually do that. But when I say, okay, I can be with how painful this is, I can actually, I can be with the part of me that is experiencing the grief, the fear, the anguish, that moves me to realize how I am showing up differently with myself than I could have 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Like I'm actually building a relationship with myself that is brave and sturdy and wise enough to hold all of the pain that I could ever feel. And in that, I'm recognizing the sense of capacity, clarity, sturdiness, love, tenderness, bravery, wisdom, that again is there in the presence of the pain, not to the exclusion of it.
That's really powerful. And I can say, mercy and tenderness to you in these seasons, because I think we do kind of have this temptation to believe like, oh, if I do enough work, then I don't have to suffer. And I think it is a paradoxical way of like, no, I think your tenderness grows, your vulnerability grows, like you said, your capacity to be with the pain, to be with the fear, to not split, like to resist that movement toward like, no, I've got to shut these things down, or I've got to make meaning in a world that like makes this feel good or be okay, or but it doesn't necessarily make the suffering any easier. It can feel more robust, but also more life generating in some ways. You spend a lot of time talking about that, like complexity and expansiveness of returning to ourselves. What does like the maturing of an arrested development, like what does it begin to look like? And I think part of that really ties in well with that sense of recovery, because so much of the work is also like recovering parts of us that got buried under things that they were never meant to hold. And like we need them, like we need those parts of us with ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to be like, and we're taking all of this toxic stuff with us. I think we absolutely get to say, that's no longer mine. And it wasn't really supposed to be mine to begin with. But that leads to a sense of, and this is kind of where I want to circle back to where we began, of like this history of religious trauma. Because a core part of the healing process, especially when we're talking about spiritually abusive structures, because it's pretty much impossible to wake up to the reality of religious trauma and spiritual abuse and not be confronted with a pretty profound complicity in systems that we participated in wittingly or unwittingly. So you invite us to this sense of like accountability, lament, repair as like, in some ways sisters of this recovery process, that as we gain like ground and maturity and cohesion of self, that we feel more sturdy. Like we're often, I think the way you put it, like looking at the hurt we've caused requires courage to wade into the pit of grief, knowing we have ground beneath us, a spark inside of us, and a community around us that will support us so we won't collapse into a hopeless spiral of shame. And I just found those words to be really comforting to me in my own journey of reckoning with some of the legacy I've inherited, and that the recovery process can't just be about me, that I am connected to many others, and their healing is intrinsically wrapped up in my healing, and vice versa. So on this kind of Indigenous Peoples Day, I'm thinking about that with more particularity, and what does accountability, what does lament, what does repair look like, and how do I have imagination that too is a part of like healing, and that I won't collapse under the weight of the shame and also the grief, the shame and the grief. So would love to hear more from some of your wisdom on this journey, and even maybe around like that community around us. Because I think when we're healing from spiritual trauma, that's the piece that often feels like, well, I don't have that anymore, or I don't know how to have that. I don't know how to build that.
I am aware that one of the wounds of spiritual trauma that lives in many of us is individualism, and particularly individualism as it has infiltrated our theology around salvation and the perception of salvation as being an individual phenomena, which many of us carry the legacy of even after maybe we've left a faith tradition or religious tradition, that we are thinking about trying to do healing all on our own, that we're thinking about trying to do a salvation effort of our own psyche all on our own. And it's so important that we're borrowing from other people, that we are in relationship with other people and other systems and the circle of all living things. I know that you're right, for people who leave religious contexts and have spiritual trauma, it can be such a lonely time. I mean, that's one of the things that the research literature suggests is contributing to really the acute mental health distress post deconstruction and de-identification and spiritual trauma is, so not only have I lost my meaning-making system, And so much of my life, I've lost the community that helps me make sense of hard things. So being able to find community in non-human ways, I think can be essential for us to I'm really interested in post-humanist philosophy at the time and thinking about the way that when we transcend species, we find mothers in trees and forests. We find sisters and cousins and uncles in ocean and orca and raven and fir and balsam and acorns and all of the things and the seasons, right? To find a family in seasons for me has been such a gift and for so many of my patients. But I think when we can allow ourselves to be loved deeply and accepted deeply, that we become capable of holding that possibility inside of ourselves, that we are held, that we are loved, that we are good enough, that someone can be let close to our pain and stay. And when we can trust our goodness, I think is actually when we are best and most well positioned to be doing the grief, the lament, the accountability work. I think it is when we have a sure sense of self, which, I mean, who does permanently, but like sure enough, let's say sure enough, sense of self and sense of goodness, inner goodness, like the truth of who we are is that I am loved and lovable, and I'm a part of this system of things, and I receive love, and I also can give it, and I have been hurt, and I have also hurt. It's when we are sure of ourselves and our goodness that we can be brave enough to look at how we've hurt people without moving into the defensive shame spiral, without moving into the collapse, without moving into and now I have to rescue you and do everything that actually was done initially to cause these wounds, like to move into being the rescuer, to feel like I have to do it on my own. So I think really the sense of goodness and the sense of interconnectedness is a very important set of the foundation with which to do really sustainable repair work. And that goes for wounds we've inflicted on other people and also the systems that we've been a part of. It is, as I've been learning from elders around repair work, decolonizing work, mending of systems, really from like a justice perspective. It is such a novice idea to feel like, oh, I see the harm, I'm going to rush out and do it all on my own, and I'm going to do it from a place of guilt and fear. Like that actually doesn't disrupt the systems that wounded us, and it just reenacts them.
No, it's such and it's like such a sabotaging tendency, because it's like it's only going to reinforce I'm not good, and I don't belong, and I wounded again. It just brings up like all the defensiveness, but it's such this would maybe just be like my little tip for myself and others. Like it's part of why we can't do all of our healing work in social media, like intellectual intake. Like we've got to get in our bodies. And these algorithms, it's not to say we don't get to stay in conversations or connected in ways that are really helpful, but the algorithms are not for our embodiment. They are for our fight, flight, or freeze, constant reaction, and taking in way more information than we could ever metabolize around belonging and goodness and possibility of repair. So
what a place to land. Holy, exactly. Well said.
It's a part of healing from abuse and spiritual abuse. It's not an invitation to check out or to not care. I just think part of the work is getting to build new neural pathways that help us sustain. So I'm just very grateful for you. I'm grateful for the ways in which you are locating this conversation and this labor like in the community of God, and in a way that actually does feel very liberative and calls to a deeper work. So grateful for you, and hope that the goodness and kindness that you're putting out there is returned to you. So thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any final words, I can leave a little space for that. It's also well to say goodbye.
Yeah, just I think maybe wanting to leave people with a deep sense of knowing that even if you listening to this don't have contact with this place inside of yourself, I have a deep, deep, unshakable trust, unwavering knowing that you are good at your core, that your body is wise, and that even if it feels hard right now, that you can come to a place where you trust yourself.
Thank you again for joining us. We hope that the conversations we share with you here on the Allender Center Podcast have touched your heart and sparked a sense of hope within you. Our work at the Allender Center is fueled by the support of people like you. As a nonprofit organization housed within the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, our mission is to boldly engage the impact of trauma and abuse on the human heart and to provide hope and healing to individuals, families, and communities. Your contributions directly contribute to making this vision a reality. If you feel moved to join us in this work, we invite you to consider making a one-time or monthly gift. Your donation, no matter the size, plays a significant role in bringing the hope of redemption and healing to so many. To give, simply visit theallendercenter.org/give. Once again, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for your support. Together, we can continue to bring hope and healing to those who need it. Thank you.
The Allender Center Podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.